Hi everyone, this is Dr. V with our next video lecture on the topic, the logic of ethics. Our logic of lectures make use of the elements of thought from the foundation of critical thinking. In each of the logic of lectures, I take the topic or the chapter associated with the lecture, and I apply the elements of thought to that material. In these slides, I include the types of questions typically associated with each element of thought, but you can learn more about them by revisiting the critical thinking video lecture or reading about these topics at the Foundation for Critical Thinking website, www.criticalthinking.org. Additionally, remember to look for, listen to, and think about the fundamental concepts of management. These concepts are those of subjective reality, congruence, and contingency. I provide definitions for each of these in the syllabus, and you can look at a dictionary to get some additional information on each one. The video lectures that we're going through used in this class are intended to be experiential, and they involve reflective writing assignments. Throughout the lecture, you'll be asked to pause the video and write a response to a topical question. If you are viewing this video as a requirement for one of my online classes, remember to record all of your responses in a single Word document, which will be submitted to the Ethics Safe Assignment link that'll be due at the end of the day on Thursday. I'm going to start this week with assumptions. The element of thought related to assumptions speaks to the implicit theories we bring, our background narrative for why, what, and how. These are the things that we implicitly believe to be true, and we often fail to question whether in fact they are true. When we think about assumptions in ethics, we are asking, what do we take for granted about ethics, and what underlies the inferences we make about ethics? Ethics, remember, is simply behavior that is congruent with values. But whose values? The individual, the organization, society at large? Typically, the answer to this is yes, all of them. But that itself suggests a huge assumption. The assumption there is that the individual, the organization, and the societal values are themselves congruent. There's even actually a second assumption buried in the definition of ethics, that ethical action itself is constant, and that there is therefore a right and wrong, and it's a clearly definable right and wrong. Now, please don't mistake me as saying here that there are some things because there are some things that are truly wrong, and there are some things that are truly right, but always becomes a bit of a problem. So while there are many things that are very wrong, there are many things that are very right. It's hard to say that there are things that there are many things that are always wrong, but there are some things that are always wrong. But let me use an example of one of the most basic moral wrongs: killing another human being. Murder's wrong, and it's morally contemptible in virtually every situation. But is killing another human being always wrong? What about in self-defense? If the situation places your life in danger, is it unethical to defend yourself or the life of a loved one? For the most part in Western thought, the answer is no, it's actually not unethical. It's perfectly okay, and in some cases considered the appropriate thing to do to defend yourself, to defend your life or the life of a loved one, even if that causes the death of the person that placed them in risk. What about in war? Now it's not necessarily about self-defense, but if your nation has asked a soldier to go somewhere and to kill people, is that unethical? For the most part, in Western thought, the answer is no, it's not unethical. It's accepted, regrettable, certainly, but it's not unethical to kill in war, although it's certainly unethical to kill certain people during a war. So when the setting changes from peace to war, the way we evaluate the behavior, killing, changes. In my examples for situation and setting, I stated for the most part and in Western thought. That phrase implies two more assumptions. First, Western thought, that's predominantly going to be your Western European and North American thinking, views it one way, which suggests that perspectives in other parts of the world might differ. Also, when I said for the most part, that carries the assumption that even in Western thought, there are some who would disagree and hold a completely different standard, might possibly suggesting that killing is always unethical, regardless of the situation or regardless of the setting. In other words, there are sets of standards that we have to apply to the behavior and the situation and the setting. Okay, let's get started with entry number 1. It's going to be your turn now. Let's start with a very basic assumption of business, the profit motive. For the most part in Western thought, and nearly always in business thinking, the pursuit of profit is appropriate. And indeed, when we think about the framework of enjoying the fruits of your labor, the profit motive is even an ethical one. It's something that we accept as being right and correct to do. So what are the exceptions? When isn't it okay? Or specifically, when is it unethical for a firm to pursue a profit? I want you to think about a situation where it's unethical. I want you to think about a setting where it's unethical. And I want you to try to think about a set of standards where it might be unethical. Now, don't worry too much if you're struggling differentiating between settings and situations, but try to give me one of each. And try to do your best to relate them to your understandings of settings and situations. Remember, it's a good idea to use the dictionary, and dictionary.com is a great resource when you're trying to clarify the difference between words. Okay, let's turn to the element of thought, information. When we think about information, we are thinking about facts, data, and things that we can measure or at least compare and contrast. When I discussed assumptions, I introduced 3 pieces of information that one would need to think about: settings, situations, and standards. But I also mentioned another piece of information: values. Ethical action, remember, is value congruent action. That means that before we can evaluate whether an action is ethical or not, we need to know what values it should be held up to. On this slide, I provide 3 categories of values. Instrumental and terminal values are values that are generally the property of individuals. Instrumental values are the means, the values. They speak to how we might expect to go about doing something. Terminal values are ends values. They address our lifelong goals and the destinations that we're setting out as we pursue our daily lives. Organizational values, by comparison, represent a battery of values that an organization might have. We're going to come back to these organizational values much later in this semester when we talk about organizational culture. Each of these categories that I provide is not necessarily an exhaustive list. There are likely to be values that you could add to each of these lists. But more importantly, each of these categories are also not all-inclusive. Just because something is listed as an instrumental value doesn't mean that all individuals hold that value. Rather, these should be thought of as a set of potential values for an individual. Each one of us has some of these values and possibly not others of these values. Also, for each of the values that we hold some far more dear than we hold others. That's going to be the point of this second writing activity. I want you to look at the list of the instrumental values that I provided, and I want you to arrange them into 3 bins or 3 columns, or you could use a table and put it into 3 columns of a table. The first bin, or the first column, should be values that I hold dear, where you're talking about yourself. The second bin, or the second column, should be values that I'm indifferent to, or I don't care much about, but I'm not against. The third bin, or the third column, should be labeled values I disagree with. Okay, once you've built that table, I want you to sort the terminal values into the 3 bins. Values that you hold dear should be put into the first bin, or the first column. Values that you're indifferent to and you don't really care much about, but you're not opposed to, would go into the second column. And values that you're opposed to or you really disagree with would go into the third column. They don't have to sort evenly, and it is possible that you might have one of the bins completely empty. But you need to have some things in the bin that's called values I hold dear. You have to pick some of these values as important to you. Once you've done the sorting activity, the second thing I want you to do is rank the values in each bin from the most important to you to the least important to you within that bin. So therefore, the values that you hold most dear, which are really the most dear and which are less dear. You're not allowed to have ties on this step. You have to split the difference and you have to decide which one's more important than the other. While 2 of the values may feel of similar importance to you, I want you to try to distinguish between the ones you consider the most important most of the time and ones which are lesser importance most of the time within each bin. You may need to look up some of these terms, and I would rather you use a dictionary or a thesaurus than to have you try to guess what something means. When in doubt, look it up. Let's move on to how points of view informs our thinking about ethics. On the last slide, we considered values as pieces of information, and I asked you to categorize and prioritize a list of values as they pertain to you. Assuming you answered that truthfully, the top items on your hold most dear bin are the ones that should exert the most influence on you when you decide how you should and should not act. When you are around other people who have similar dominant values, you're going to find a consistency in values with them and likely a corresponding consistency in behavior. You and those like you are likely to interpret similar behaviors in similar ways. But what about somebody different than you? How might they view things? That's going to be the topic of our third writing activity this week. I want you to compare your dominant values to a different set of dominant values and think about how they might view the same thing. The first thing I want you to do is take the top values, the top 3 values from your most dear bin, and I want you to treat these as your values. Use these values to answer this question. Is it okay to take an excessively long lunch break at work? Be careful to interpret this question through the 3 values that you chose to place emphasis on. Don't try to integrate the situation or the setting into this. Just simply give it a broad general answer. Why or why not, according to the values that you chose, is it okay or wrong? Make sure to highlight the values that you used within the answer that you give. Now, take the bottom 3 values in your values I disagree with bin, or if you don't have 3 values there, find just simply the 3 lowest values from your sorting of the last activity, even if that means you have to just take the 3 least important of your most dear values. I want you to now answer the same question using these 3 values. Once again, try to answer consistently with the values that you list and try to answer in a broad, general manner. And once again, please highlight the values that you used to detail this answer. So finally, as a third point to this, how do the 2 answers differ, or do they differ? Do they differ on their rightness or the wrongness, or do they differ on the reasons, even if they come to the same conclusion? Assuming that you have a difference along either of these lines, you've just stepped into the shoes of a person who thinks completely differently than you, even if it was just for a moment. I want to use the implications element of thought to draw a distinction between ethical thinking and ethical behavior. Ethical behavior is, as we've already defined, behavior that is consistent with values. You can engage in ethical behavior with or without thinking deeply about it. Somebody could conduct themselves ethically just by following rules and mirroring the behavior of exemplars, people who model ethical action. That, though, only works to the extent that you actually have a correct behavior modeled or a rule for every possible situation and setting and every possible behavior. Realistically, that's unlikely. Indeed, at some point, you are going to encounter a situation, a setting, or a value conflict that creates a confound. It places you in a moment of uncertainty, where right and wrong seem light years away from the decision you're trying to make. It is at these moments that ethical thinking becomes crucial. Ethical thinking is really what this chapter is all about. Ethical thinking is a way of evaluating the behavior in question and judging its ethicality. It requires you to use some of the tools we've already talked about, the idea of situations, settings, and values, as well as some of the concepts that we're going to come to later. I'm going to make the point here that ethical thinking is a subset of critical thinking. And so the critical thinking idea, the idea of critical thinking being reasoned, purposeful, measured, and rigorous, that applies here. But ethical thinking is just a subset of critical thinking. It asks you to be reasoned and purposeful. It asks you to be measured and rigorous. It asks you to apply the elements of thought to the issues related to ethics. For ethical thinking to be a subset of critical thinking, though, that implies that there's a type of critical thinking that's not about ethics. It also implies that there may be types of critical thinking that facilitate unethical thinking. If you remember the video lecture on critical thinking, I asked you to answer what's wrong with this picture about a pair of modern media images. Poorly created infographics aren't necessarily unethical. They could simply be the product of poor critical thinking. But one could imagine that someone who is a critical thinker, but unethical, could use critical thinking resulting in behaviors which are decidedly unethical. That's going to be the point of journal entry number 4. I want you to describe, detail, or explain in the best terms that you can come up with what unethical critical thinking would look like and mean. The point of this task is to help you to contrast two ideas. In this case, I want you to contrast critical thinking with ethical thinking and try to explain how they are different things by focusing on how critical thinking could lead to unethical action as opposed to how it could lead to ethical action. The element of thought related to purpose asks us to consider the goals or points or the central aim of an idea. In the case of ethics in a management class, we think about the purpose when we ask ourselves, what are managers trying to accomplish with ethics, or what is the central aim of ethics in management? This is a good place to bring in the fundamental concepts. Remember, fundamental concepts are the deep, powerful concepts which influence or explain or illustrate most of the things that we think about within a discipline. In this case, the fundamental concepts of management should help us understand the purpose of ethics within management. I've developed 3 fundamental concepts in the syllabus, one on subjective reality, one on congruence, and one on contingency. I've included these in the syllabus, and we've worked on them in previous video lectures. On this slide, I provide an excerpt from the syllabus, but you can also review the syllabus and you can look at the dictionary to help influence your understanding of some of these words as well. I want you to pick one of the fundamental concepts and use it to address one of the 2 purpose questions at the top of this slide. One way to think about this writing question is to ask yourself, how does ethical thinking influence the way a manager should approach one of these fundamental concepts, subjective reality, congruence, or contingency? But you only have to tackle one of the fundamental concepts today, but all of them could give you a direction. The element of thought dealing with questions and issues helps us to deconstruct the problems we identify. When we explore questions and issues, we ask ourselves, what questions do we face, and also what complicates these questions? When I discussed the implications of management, I introduced the idea of ethical thinking. I brought this into discussion under the idea that ethical thinking is necessary to address behaviors where values may conflict or when situations or settings call to question the general ethicality of a behavior. We call these moments ethical dilemmas. Life isn't as simple as good and bad, and even where good and bad are appropriate terms, good people sometimes do bad things and bad people sometimes do good things. Your textbook outlines 6 types of ethical dilemmas: environmental dilemmas, privacy dilemmas, conflict of interest dilemmas, trade secret dilemmas, bribery dilemmas, and whistleblowing dilemmas. I want to use the idea of questions and issues as a way to drill deeper into the issue of a moral dilemma. For example, consider the moral dilemma of privacy. We don't have a generic constitutional right to privacy, although we do have certain constitutional privacy protections, but those primarily pertain to the relationship between the individual and the state. There's also a body of case law and regulation that require businesses to protect certain types of information. But in general, we don't have a specific right to privacy in our interactions with business. But people often expect that they have the right to some privacy in their business affairs. To apply questions and issues as an element of thought to this moral dilemma, we should raise questions and issues that we would need to address to develop an ethical policy regarding privacy. Here are some of the questions and issues a firm might consider. How does the firm view the privacy rights of the employee, and how do they view the privacy rights of the customer, and how do those differ from the privacy rights of other organizational stakeholders? How much of the information that you have about your employees or customers is fair to use in your profit-seeking activity? Can you data mine your customers? Can you data mine your employees? Should your employees have privacy in their personal, that is, their non-work related communications while at their workplace? Does this change if they're off the clock but using a personal device like a mobile phone? How about a personal mobile device but over a business Wi-Fi connection? Assuming that there is some level of privacy for employees, under what situations or settings is it appropriate to violate that right to privacy? That isn't an exhaustive list of questions and issues, and I can't provide you with an exact listing of the answers to these questions because they're very subjective. There is some legal guidance on this issue, but much of that is related to fairly dated forms of communication like mail, snail mail, paper mail. And it doesn't line up with our mobile and cloud-based computing world that we live in. Indeed, lacking a clear legal framework, this issue is completely an ethical issue, and each firm has to decide, and this is often done on a firm-by-firm and case-by-case basis. So now it's your turn. I want you to drill deeper on one of the other ethical dilemmas. I've already given you a set of questions and issues to think about with personal privacy. I want you to pick one of the other business moral dilemmas developed in Chapter 1, and from that create your own list of questions and issues. Try to come up with at least 2 or 3 questions and issues, and then pick one of those and briefly state your thoughts on what an appropriate answer to that question would be, and how did you come to that conclusion? What makes that seem like the right answer to you? As an element of thought, concepts deals with the major terms, definitions, main ideas, or the models that are associated with the topic. When I discussed the assumptions of ethics, I introduced a behavior situation setting standard framework. We have already spent a bit of time thinking about behaviors and situations and settings. Now it's time to think about standards. Your textbook details frameworks for ethical evaluation. These are models used to evaluate the ethicality of behavior, and models are an aspect of concepts in the elements of thought. The 3 primary models detailed in your textbook are utilitarianism, Kantian ethics, and distributive justice. I briefly summarize each of the 3 on this slide, and your textbook, of course, goes into a bit more detail on each of these as well. These models are important tools in ethical thinking, and you'll see them again and again in this course, and you will see them in your future courses as well. And they always apply when we're talking about ethical thinking. Each of these provides a framework or a different way to think about and evaluate ethics. The framework, thus, becomes a crucial element in ethical thinking. Often, the 3 frameworks will produce a similar perspective on a topic, but occasionally they stand in contrast to each other. Those moments when these 3 different models, these 3 different tools, are themselves different, are quite likely to be some of the most important of ethical dilemmas. Let's consider one of those issues and how it's playing out in our current daily lives. Since 9/11, our government has enacted and conducted an extensive array of intelligence gathering. This intelligence gathering includes monitoring and inspecting of virtually all communication between people within and people outside of the United States. And it even entails a significant amount of data collection and data mining on the information that's transmitted entirely in the United States. The processes that are being used are largely invisible and largely outside of judicial oversight, as it would jeopardize the efficacy of intelligence gathering if the bad guys out there knew what communications were being compromised. The invasiveness and lack of transparencies in these areas, in these searches, call to question fundamental rights of privacy, and this is the specific privacy right between the citizen and the state that's protected under the Constitution. There have been court challenges on these issues, and generally the findings and the rulings have been in favor of the federal government, but a number of the judges that have been involved in these cases have themselves expressed some extreme discomfort with the state and the direction of these intelligence gathering processes. So it is legal, or at least it's not currently illegal, but is it ethical? What do the 3 frameworks contribute? Utilitarianism is actually the justification for this intelligence gathering activity. Under utilitarianism, ethics is a function of the greater good. From this position, one would argue that yes, the privacy of some individuals being violated, and yes, due process is being circumvented and avoided in some cases, but in the interest of preventing another terrorist attack, in the interest of preventing a large number of people dying or being tragically harmed, that's acceptable. A greater good is being served. Thus, a utilitarianism examination of this would conclude that this is in fact an ethical course of action. Kantian ethics, though, suggests otherwise. Ben Franklin was drawing on Kantian ethics when he argued that, when he made the famous quote, that those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. This is an argument that is grounded on individual rights, as opposed to an argument that is built upon the economic calculus of ethics that utilitarianism uses. Under a Kantian ethical perspective, if we're sacrificing a fundamental value, in this case liberty, to pursue a lower order value, in this case safety, we've sacrificed something far more important, our core value. So in a Kantian ethical perspective, at least, and particularly the way Franklin voiced it, would find that this modern intelligence gathering activities is actually unethical. What about distributive justice? How does it weigh in? The breadth and completeness of the intelligence gathering itself seems equitable or fair, since everyone's being monitored. So if it's looking at everybody and it's using this fair process, well, that's fair. That's at least leaning towards ethics. But the lack of transparency in this process is troubling, frightening. Having little ability to audit or monitor the actions of intelligence gathering itself exposes us to a violation of equity. We can't know with certainty, since we can't know at all, whether this process is being applied fairly. Who watches the watchman? That's discomforting from a distributive justice perspective. So distributive justice would likely be indeterminate on this issue. As it's currently implemented, the lack of transparency leans towards being unethical. But if that were addressed and the process was being applied fairly, it might be ethical from a distributive justice perspective. So we have one issue, intelligence gathering by the state. We have three different ethical frameworks, and they give us three completely different answers. That is a moral dilemma. I want you to work through this moral dilemma. First, consider the arguments that I made from utilitarianism framework, a Kantian ethical framework, and a distributive justice framework. Which of these three arguments, which of these three positions seems most appropriate to you? So first, the first thing you need to do is answer which seems to be the correct course of action, which seems to be the right model to apply here. And then I want you to tell me why. In your response to why, consider which instrumental and terminal values that we talked about back in the information slide are you bringing in, and which of these instrumental and terminal values are you embracing when you chose here, which ethical framework you're going to adopt. This brings us to the last element of this video lecture, implications. Implications deal with consequences. What is the likely outcome of good management? What is the likely outcome of ethical management? Alternately, you can think of implications as a way of creating advice. What should an ethical manager do, and what should an ethical manager not do? Inferences and conclusions are the points where we pull together the relevant information, apply the appropriate concepts to reach or infer a conclusion. Technically, all of the elements of thought play a role here, but for simplicity's sake, we only have to look at a couple of them for the activity I put together today. But it'll help you greatly if you think about the other elements as you progress through this activity. I want you to engage in ethical thinking on a specific issue. Why is it unethical to exaggerate on your resume? That's going to be your final entry this week. I want you to consider this question from three elements. I want you to think about it from the points of view, I want you to think about it from concepts, and then I want you to think about it and I want you to go through the process of drawing an inference. So first, I want you to think about what relevant values are at play, and I want you to think about them from the perspective of two different organizational stakeholders. The first stakeholder is the hiring manager, the person who's making a decision on who to hire for the job on this, where these resumes are coming in. And the second stakeholder is a customer of the firm. So this is somebody not even involved in the hiring decision, but somebody who will be affected by the performance of the organization. If a job candidate lies on his or her resume, how does this affect the hiring manager? How does this affect the customer? What values are being violated here, and what values, if any, are being protected here? The second thing I want you to do is I want you to consider what a utilitarian argument would be here, a Kantian argument would be here, and a distributive justice argument would be here. And then finally, I want you to use your answers from points of view, and I want you to use your answers from concepts to draw an inference that gives us the advice to managers. So if a manager needed to be able to tell somebody why is it unethical to exaggerate on your resume, you're creating the statement, you're creating the advice statement, and you're going to use points of view and concepts to create that statement. So this is an ethical thinking activity where you're working through elements of thought to lead to an action statement. That's it for this week's video lecture. This has been the logic of ethics. Remember, you need to prepare your responses to all of the entries that we've gone through in this video, and you need to put them in a Word document, and that needs to be submitted as an upload through the Safe Assign function of your Blackboard shell this week by end of day on Thursday. Remember to start reading your next set of reading activities and prepare the next round of SEIs, and I will see you in the next video lecture.